Good afternoon, everyone, from Dunrovin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. I'm delighted to have our favorite wildlife biologist from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks with us again today, Tori Ritter. You've been out here several times, have you not, Tori?
Yep, absolutely. I love it out there. I float
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah. Tori has given us some background information on ospreys and on turkeys, and he's kind of our go-to guy for wildlife education. And I can't tell you how much we appreciate it, Tori. Can you give us a little bit of your own background? You're a non-game biologist, are you not? And what does that mean?
Yeah, so I'm the non-game wildlife biologist for our state wildlife agency, which is Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So I'm in the wildlife category there. And non-game basically means that if you don't hunt it or fish for it or trap it, then that's kind of my wheelhouse. So that's songbirds, amphibians, reptiles, small mammals, all those sort of critters out there. It's around 300, 400 different species in Montana
Yeah.
that
Well,
is economically important.
but ecologically important. In fact, when we were talking just a moment before we got started here, you told me that yesterday was a busy day for doing some frog surveys. Is that correct? Can you?
Yeah, so we were we were surveying for a frog called the Rocky Mountain tailed frog. It's a really ancient frog species. It only exists in cold, fast-flowing streams, which is really, really odd for a frog species. Almost all the other ones need warmer waters and
Huh?
ponds and sloughs. So they were doing, the fisheries biologists had done a road-known project up there, which is basically where they poison out non-native fish, and that can also impact the frogs. So we're doing this sort of side study to see how the frogs recover after that treatment.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, non-native fish. That's one of the things we will talk about today. I've asked
Yep.
Tori to join us. Although you're not a fisheries biologist, you're the non-game biology purview is basically mammals and birds and reptiles, not fish, correct?
Correct. Yep.
But you still know a lot about fish, and you rub elbows with a lot of people who are fisheries biologists. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there's very little, I mean, wildlife and fisheries overlap all the time. I mean, the riparian areas that are around the rivers and streams are like the most biologically rich areas
Yeah.
of Montana. So really, it's all related. And of course, the relationship between ospreys and fish obviously is another great area of overlap because the ecology of the fish that the osprey hunts and the ecology of the overall river environment and the fish within that context are all intimately tied to how well the ospreys do and if they can get enough food in their entire life history.
Exactly. And in fact, that's how we started the web camera here at Dunrovin is we collaborated with a couple of scientists at the University of Montana who were looking at water quality. And they wanted a web camera so that they could count the number of fish and identify the species of fish that the chicks ate. And the idea is that because chicks eat only fish and they come from local waters, and they are what you would call apex predators. Could you explain what that means to us?
You refer to the osprey as the apex predator?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that basically means that there's nothing that eats ospreys. They are basically, they don't have to worry about predation for the most part. They can die from getting into fights with other ospreys or bald eagles, and sometimes great horned owls will actually prey on osprey chicks, so they'll actually grab them off of the nest. But other than that, once ospreys are adults, I mean, they're kind of top down, meaning they're eating other stuff. They're not going to eat it themselves.
So as an apex predator who is focused on fish, anything that the fish eats tends to accumulate in the blood of the ospreys. Isn't that kind of the theory of studying ospreys relative to water quality?
Right, yeah, it's called bioaccumulation. So heavy metals or other contaminants get into, the smallest bits of food in the river ecosystem, like the algae and the diatoms and the mosses and those kind of things. And then the little invertebrates eat those, and they get a certain amount of those contaminants. And then the fish eat those little invertebrates, and they get more of those contaminants. And it actually, even though the body size goes up, is as you go up that food chain, the concentration of the contaminants actually increases regardless of body size. So by the time the ospreys are eating those fish, it's several stages up that food chain, and they're actually can get quite a bit of those contaminants.
Yeah, so that's what the scientists at the University of Montana wanted to look at, was the presence of heavy metals in the blood of osprey chicks. And that's why this whole endeavor got started out here at Dunrovin. Well, first of all, thank you for coming, Tori. And what I had asked Tori to do this time was to really focus on the fish in the Bitterroot River, because we see a lot of fish coming to the osprey's nest here at Dunrovin. And I won't say that all of them come from the Bitterroot River, but the vast majority do. We do have this little lake over here. You are aware of it, and I'm not even exactly sure what they call that lake that's right here in Lolo, the Lolo Slough. I'm not sure what they call that.
Oh,
lake.
north of town there?
Yes, north of town. And it has some fish in there. And then our osprey has found a private pond with goldfish.
I don't have that on my slideshow.
I'll show you later. And I do kind of want to talk to you about that because it's interesting to me. At any rate, so when you go through your slideshow, Tori, I would appreciate your helping us kind of look at what we should be looking for as we see fish, okay? And I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna share my screen for just a moment, okay?
Okay.
And the reason I'm going to is I want to show you what we see. I'm just gonna show you a few photos here of what we see at the nest. This is the kind of view of a fish that we get, okay?
Okay.
So you can, I mean, sometimes the head is on, sometimes the head is not on. Sometimes we can see the entire fin, the dorsal fin, the back fin. Sometimes we can't. And so it's highly variable what we're seeing, and the focus is sometimes variable. So here you're getting more of an indication of the size than, you know, and you can see a little bit, but not a lot. And then other times we get a pretty good view. Here's a head-on fish, and
that's very interesting. I honestly didn't even know we had catfish around. Hopefully, that's from one of those private ponds and not from the Bitterroot. But that's really good to know. I'll have to pass that along to our fisheries biologist.
Yeah,
That's
and
really interesting.
then here are these goldfish that he's been bringing in, and sometimes he'd bring them in 2 at a time. But that's a fairly good sized fish, you know?
Yeah, goldfish are often constrained in how big they grow by the size of their tank. So they grow and fill up the size of the tank and become square or something, but they'll kind of not grow any bigger once they run out of a certain amount of room. So once you put them into a pond, they can get really big.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, you know, you get a little bit of the color, but not, you know, you don't get to see the whole fish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to show you these at first was, as you walk us through the different kinds of fish, you might want to tell us the really distinctive characters that we might want to look for, you know, whether it's color or fin or whatever. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and ask you to move forward. Thanks, Tori.
You're welcome. And what might be fun to do is after we go through this, we can go back to a few of those photos and I can kind of show you what I saw to help me distinguish what type of fish I thought.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so I'll share my screen here. Ooh, can't do that for some reason.
Great, I'm seeing it.
All right. Okay, so yeah, today I'm just going to talk about some of the fish that you might be seeing come to the nest from that lower Bitterroot area. And I'll try to kind of put those fish into the context of osprey ecology and then kind of give you a little bit about the fish, the ecology of the fishes as well. So a few things about osprey and fish to kind of help us think about the different fishes and how they fit into the osprey's diet. Of course, 99% of their food is fish. People have seen them grab some other strange things here and there, but it's almost all fish. They've taken over 80 different species of fish. That's across saltwater and freshwater, 30 different species in freshwater. So they can take a really wide variety of species. But generally, they're focused on 2 to 3 different species in most areas. And that can be for all sorts of reasons. It's how vulnerable the fish are to osprey predation. It can be the abundance of the fish. It can be their behaviors. It really just depends. But for the most part, I think it's just whether or not the fish in the area are vulnerable to getting hit by osprey.
And let me ask you about that, Tori.
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability, I would assume, would part of that would be where in the water column they tend to hang out.
Yep, exactly.
They're in the top part or the bottom part. Is that correct?
Yeah, and how deep the water is and whether the water is flat on the surface or riffly.
Uh-huh.
I'll talk about that a little bit individually for each species and what makes them vulnerable or not. So osprey are generally less efficient when they're trying to hunt in areas with thick emergent or submerged vegetation. So emergent is like cattails and willows and things that grow up out of the water. That'll come into play with a few of the species we talk about. They use a really wide variety of hunting techniques, and it'll really depend on the depth of the water or what fish they're targeting. I was on a float the other day and I saw a hunting technique I've never seen osprey do before, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of osprey hunting attempts. This one came in kind of low on the water, and then it just dropped almost like a 90-degree angle, and it skimmed its talons across the water like really fast. And at the very end, it kind of like dunked a little bit and had a whitefish in its claws for a little bit, and then it dropped it. So I think the whitefish just shook enough to get away. But I had never seen one do that before, that really fast, like skim across the water. So, I mean, I've seen them, they'll perch up in a tree and then dive straight down. They'll hover over one spot and then dive straight down. They'll come in really, really low and kind of do like bald eagles do, where they'll just dunk their claws in and grab one. So they're really, really flexible in how they can go after these species. Sorry about that. So benthic feeding fish, meaning fish that feed on the bottom, are the easiest to catch for osprey if they're in shallow waters, which is not always guaranteed. So that's suckers and whitefish on the Bitterroot are kind of considered benthic feeding fish because they're always down on the bottom eating stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about why that makes them vulnerable. In the limnetic zone, which is the area of the water that still gets sunlight and is still lit by sunlight but isn't necessarily really shallow, piscivorous fish, meaning fish that eat other fish, are harder to catch than non-piscivorous fish, and we'll talk about that as well. And I just thought this was interesting. Across all the studies that were compiled in this one report I saw, foraging efficiency was between 19 and 69%. So even the best, most successful ospreys out there in the world that have been studied are still missing over a quarter of the time when they go for a fish. So they're really good, but fish are pretty good at escaping too. So we'll jump into the fish that ospreys might be bringing to the nest. We'll start with the native fish. These are fish that have been in the Bitterroot system, have evolved with all the plants and animals around there since they came into existence. And I'm going to start with the sort of lesser known native fish, or maybe the less respected, I guess, in a way, native fish. Because
less sought after by fishermen.
Exactly, yeah. So one of my favorite fish is the northern pikeminnow. This is one of the largest fish in the pikeminnow family, or in the minnow family. So, most minnows are really small fish up to a few inches, but northern pikeminnow can get up to 7 pounds. So there's some really, really big fish out there. And especially on the lower Bitterroot, because they like warmer waters, these guys are everywhere, especially the big backwater sloughs and the slower parts of the river. And they're very predatory. They go after fish. They go after everything from little aquatic invertebrates like mayflies and caddisflies all the way up to like mice. I mean, they're really, really aggressive when they get big. Fishermen catch them a lot on streamers, which are flies that mimic small fish. In terms of their vulnerability to ospreys, they are pretty vulnerable because they're pretty dark on the back and you can see them really easily from above. And they tend to be slow moving. Oftentimes they're just holding in the water column, and they'll be kind of out in the open quite a bit. And because there's such a big abundance of them. So that makes them pretty vulnerable to osprey, because the osprey can see them really well, and they're generally in that kind of flat, slow water that is really easy to see through when you're looking at it from above. So accompanying with each one of these drawings, I just put a picture in. A lot of them are of my brother. I'm a non-game biologist. I'm on the wildlife side, but I've also been obsessed with fly fishing for my whole life. So I have a lot of pictures of these fish. So you'll see my brother a lot in here. So that's my brother, and that's a northern pikeminnow we caught out of the Clark Fork River.
So let me just compare them to. I mean, they have the shape of a trout, but they're not. Tell us the differences here. If looking at this, why would you say instantly it's not a trout?
So one thing is it has these kind of lips on it that don't have any teeth on them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really, really prominent. They're just very kind of hard, bony cheeks. And then all along the side is just this sort of dull olive to gold color with these sort of lighter color orangish fins. And, you know, trout will usually have speckling on them, and they'll have some brighter colors.
Right.
And they'll also have some pretty different fins. I can't really get into specifics of all the difference in the fins, but it's really worth looking at the different pictures of the fish and getting a good sense of what the fins look like. I won't be able to tell you those specifics because I didn't really prepare that ahead of time, but that's a really good indication. When I was looking at those fish from those pictures you showed me, I was really looking at the fins. One thing about the pikeminnow is they have this really heavy fork in the fin, and that's a pretty good, in the tail fin, and that's a pretty good indication of pikeminnow. There's not a lot of fish that have that deep fork. And also this very triangular, tall, pointed dorsal fin is also pretty distinctive.
Great.
Yeah.
So do people eat them? I've never fished for pike minnow. Is it pike minnow or peak minnow?
Pike minnow.
Pike minnow, are they edible?
I know that indigenous people used to eat them. I don't know of anybody that eats them now. I don't think they taste great, although I can't say I've tried it myself. They're often considered a trash fish, which is, you know, not really nice to say about any fish, but so people used to just throw them up on the bank because they thought that they competed with trout and people wanted trout around more. But they're definitely not. They're part of the ecosystem. They've been here forever. So I can't really testament to how most people aren't fishing for them. It's kind of just happens while you're fishing for trout. You randomly get one of these.
Okay.
So another really abundant native fish in the Bitterroot are suckers. We have a long-nosed sucker and a large-scale sucker. Long-nosed sucker is just in the western part of the state. Large-scale sucker is all over the entire state. It's in almost every water body. These are both native fish. They get really, really big, so they can get up to like 30 inches long. They're giant, big, big fish. And they're very dark backs. If you're floating down the river and you see a bunch of really huge fish swimming around in the bottom of the deep holes, those are almost always the large-scale suckers. And these are those benthic feeding fish. So these are on the bottom. They have these kind of sucker mouths, and they're just going along the rocks, sucking up worms or crustaceans or anything that kind of gets in their way. They're vulnerable to osprey if they're small, if they're, you know, juveniles, and they're in shallow water. But that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, they're really big and they're really deep. So I have seen osprey carrying them around. Usually it's one that's almost too big for the osprey to carry. So you're seeing the osprey like really struggling to fly. But yeah, I don't think they're quite as common. You'll see they do have a forked tail as well. It's not as prominent though as the pikeminnow. It's a little more smoothed out. And then notice that fin that has that kind of, the back end of the dorsal fin doesn't connect down to the body. That's a pretty good indication of a sucker, although we'll see some of the like largemouth bass and pike can also have that. But really, really big fins on the lower part. And if you can see the mouth, that's pretty distinctive because it's the only one that has a mouth that's sort of facing down and has a big sucker thing on it.
And using that as an identifier, they have shown up at the Dunrovin nest. The suckers have. Okay.
Yeah. There's so many of them on the river. I'm sure they get pretty common opportunities to get the smaller ones. I should have warned you about that photo. But you kind of see that we don't catch suckers very often, so he was very excited. Like how different these fish can look in real life. I mean, this one's
Yeah,
really
yeah,
orange, and you can see that. But this is what the sucker mouth looks like when it's protruding. So it's kind of this big structure on the front. But
yeah.
those big giant fins are a pretty good indication. This is a mountain whitefish. It's hard to say whether suckers or whitefish are the most abundant fish in the Bitterroot. It probably depends on what section you're in. Suckers like warmer, lower end of the river, slower waters. Whitefish are in faster, riffly, colder waters. So probably as you move from the top of the system down to where it flows in the Clark Fork, you probably shift from more whitefish to more suckers. But these are another native fish. They have a pointy little mouth. It's kind of like a sucker, but it is more forward facing, and it's very tough. It's like tough cartilage kind of. And what they're doing is they form these big schools, and they're in the substrate, just poking around among the rocks, rooting around in the gravel, and just sucking up little invertebrates, the mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies, just sucking those up all over the river. So what you'll see sometimes is these big, massive groups of mountain whitefish, especially in spawning season. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. And you'll actually see trout move in below them, and the trout will start feeding on all the stuff that the whitefish are kicking up and not actually getting into their mouths. So that's a really common game fish for osprey. Most of the ospreys I've seen on the upper river, almost always when they're carrying food, and I can see what it is, it's a whitefish, because these are all over the place in the Bitterroot. They hold in shallow water. They're not nearly as spooky as other fish. If you go snorkeling, you'll often see them just hanging right around you. They're not zipping off like the trout are. So they're really, really common fish. Are you seeing those a lot at the nest?
Well, I haven't seen them so many times at the nest, but then again, I'm not sure that I correctly identified them. But we do have a number of places right here in front of our property where you can fish whitefish in the winter, and they are very good smoked.
Yeah, they are really, really good.
They're really good smoked. So I have fished for, and I've had friends who've come out and have fished for whitefish right out here. So I'm certain that the ospreys are bringing them. But again, looking at some of the distinctive features, I see a little bit of green on the fin here, on the tail fin. And other than that, it's really kind of whitish. Is that true to form here?
Yeah, I wouldn't rely on the green on the tail. I haven't ever found that to be distinctive. This will be the hardest one to distinguish from the Pikeminnow, unless you can see the face, the head. Their jaws are completely different. You'd never mistake the jaws for a whitefish for Pikeminnow. Pikeminnow has big, big mouth. Whitefish, this little tiny pokey mouth. But if you're just seeing the back half of them, the color is probably going to be the best indication you have. Whitefish in the Bitterroot are pretty light color. They have this light kind of golden color, and they don't have a really prominent line going down the side. And their fins are lighter color than those Pikeminnows. But they definitely have a lot of overlap. Let me just go back to the Pikeminnow and see if there's...
Yeah.
They're pretty close, but you can see that really prominent line down the Pikeminnow. And the color of the fin, they have a lot thicker fin, and it's the whitefish is almost see-through. It's very kind of light color, and you can see through it really well, where those Pikeminnows will have a darker, thicker fin. Yeah, this is another fish that people used to chuck up on shore, but now most fly fisher, people that fly fish pretty much agree that if you're having a really hard time catching trout, you can almost always catch whitefish because they're everywhere and they're very eager to take a fly. So yeah, that's a really common fish. I was going to show you this. So these are the fish on the Bitterroot. They're really, really light colored because the substrate in the Bitterroot is fairly light color. These were some whitefish we caught in Idaho that were in a stream that was covered with basalt rocks on the bottom. So it was really, really dark. And I just thought it was cool that those fish seem to have evolved in some way, or, you know, a lot of fish can actually change their color pretty well, depending on how stressed they are or what they're doing. So I don't know if these ones are doing that or if they've just kind of evolved to have a darker color, but it was just kind of cool to see that difference. So moving on to our native trout, this is the Westslope cutthroat trout. It's the only native trout, well, no, sorry. It's one of two native trout that we have in the Bitterroot River system. So this is a really famous fish, really, really beautiful. This was one that I caught up in Scalco Creek down in the Bitterroot. So they can look very, very different. But the really distinctive thing is they have that slash under their throat. A lot of times they won't be this red unless it's spawning season, which is June and July. But red slash under the throat, and then the speckling that kind of is centered just all around the tail and tapers up and gets less so near the top. You can kind of see that on this one. This one has a few more speckles near the gill plate and the eye, but really heavy spotting in the back that sort of tapers away towards the front. In the lower Bitterroot, where the ospreys at Dunrovin Ranch are probably hunting, most of the cutthroats I've seen down there are pretty light kind of golden color, and the spots aren't as prominent as in these two pictures. So the spots are a little bit lighter and a little bit smaller. But they have a pretty distinctive look from the other trout you'll see. So if you nail down that it's a trout, and then it has that sort of speckling and it has that light golden color, it'll be really hard to mistake that for other fish, except for potentially rainbow trout, and we'll talk about why that is. Well, we can talk about it here. So you may see what's called a cutbow, and that's a hybrid between a cutthroat trout and a rainbow. So you can have everything. So if there's like 1% rainbow trout in a Westslope cutthroat, it'll look a lot like a Westslope cutthroat. But if there's 60% of the genes of a rainbow trout in a Westslope cutthroat, in a hybrid, it may look literally like half rainbow, half cutthroat. So you might see some of that speckling pattern, but then there's the bright rainbow colors on its side. Or you might see none of that speckling pattern, and it almost looks exactly like a rainbow, but it has the red slash under the throat. So if you're identifying cutthroats and rainbows coming to the nest, you may want to have sort of a scale, or just have rainbow, cutbow, cutthroat, and cutbow can be your category when you really can't tell, is it a cutthroat or is it a rainbow, because it's kind of in between. So that one can be a little bit tricky. And even professional fish biologists often can't tell the difference between cutbows and rainbows, or cutbows and cutthroats in the field. So there's a lot of overlap.
Tori, would you address that issue? Westslope cutthroat are native to the Bitterroot. Rainbows are not. They're introduced.
Yep.
And so what is the ecological problem with an introduced species like this that interbreeds with the native species? What kinds of ecological problems are presented by that?
Well, it's interesting because their hybridization with rainbows doesn't really change the ecological niche that they fill that much. It changes their behavior a little bit. It changes their growth patterns a little bit, but they're still available to all the fish that eat them, and they still eat the same things that they would if they weren't hybridized. So it's almost more of a, I don't even know what the right term would be, but it's more about the preservation of a native species, of genetically pure Westslope cutthroat trout that evolved in these streams, evolved with all the plant animal species around. So it's almost more of a social thing. Like, we really want to preserve these native species because they're social and uniquely adapted. There are also probably some weird genes that could come in when you're hybridizing with fish that were raised in a hatchery. We don't introduce hatchery fish into our rivers anymore. It's all wild, fish that spawn in the creeks. So we don't have to worry about that too much anymore, but it certainly introduces genes that weren't developed and kind of honed within the ecosystem where the native fish are.
So they may not be as robust because the native species have evolved for this particular set of environmental circumstances. And by introducing genes of fish that are not as robust, that could be detrimental in terms of their survival. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, there's definitely a possibility. Fish reproduce a lot, and they reproduce really fast, so they can adapt to conditions really well. But certainly when you have foreign genes coming in that weren't from a fish that evolved in this area, that can definitely sort of be an issue for that native population. And you also have with warming, the real big problem with Westslope cutthroat is warming temperatures. They're very sensitive to water temperature, and rainbows aren't. So rainbows will start hybridizing with cutthroat trout, and as waters start to warm, and you have to go further and further up the canyons to get to cold water on the spawning tributaries, those rainbows just keep kind of marching up and upstream further and further, and you can have a hybridized system all the way to the end of the drainage.
So global warming would be much more detrimental to the cutthroat trout than the rainbow trout.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can see that throughout time. The data of Westslope cutthroat, genetically pure Westslope cutthroat trout distribution is just slowly shrinking into the mountains where those cold, clear streams are left.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're indicator species in that regard, then, I would think.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
Thank you.
Kind of on that note, the next species we're going to talk about is bull trout, which is the other native trout species in Montana. And these guys are on the threatened and endangered species list. They're listed as threatened. We're kind of on the edge of their range here in Montana. So they're most abundant and doing the best in northwest Montana, and they're really struggling in the Missoula area. And these fish are even more tied to water temperature and water quality. So these fish are really, really suffering because there aren't very many cold, clear creeks left for them to spawn in. And in a lot of the cold, clear tributary creeks they used to spawn in, the history of logging in this area has created a lot of roads and a lot of soil instability that leads to sedimentation, where really fine particulate matter runs off the hillsides, gets into the creeks, and then it settles out and fills in all the spaces between the gravels. And those spaces are where fish spawn. So that's where they lay their eggs, and they need those spaces between the gravel because that's what keeps oxygen and nutrients moving through the gravel where the eggs are growing. So when all that sediment settles down in those spaces, it either chokes out the eggs completely or it just makes it so the spawning gravel isn't as suitable. So bull trout are really struggling. They're a really cool fish, really predatory. They can get to be huge. They can get up to be like 30 plus inches, just absolutely giant fish. So they've been targeted a lot by poachers because people like to catch really big fish. And they just have a very, very retracted range. It's actually illegal to purposefully fish for bull trout in Montana. So if you're up on a cold, clear stream and you see a giant fish down there and you can tell it's a bull trout and you purposely start casting at it, that's actually illegal in Montana. And that's just kind of a testament to how much these fish are struggling, that we're actually, legal methods to try to prevent people from even doing catch and release fishing, even harass them in any way because they're so sensitive. But they have amazing life histories. They spawn miles, many miles way up to these headwater streams. These big giant fish are leaping over these log jams. They're crawling their way up through these huge log jams and waterfalls and all this, and going on these amazing spawning runs. So it's a really cool fish, but really, really struggling. Both Westslope cutthroat and bull trout are pretty rare relative to other trout in the lower Bitterroot because it has a lot warmer water temperatures than the rest of the system. But Lolo Creek running in down there really puts in a lot of cold water. So you will still see bull trout and Westslope cutthroat around, mostly because they can hang out near the mouths of those cold, clear tributaries. I'm guessing you probably haven't seen a bull trout come to the Osprey nest.
I don't believe that I have, but I'm not 100% sure that I would have recognized it. No.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I keep forgetting to talk about. So in terms of identifying trout, you won't see the forked tail on trout. So that's a really good indication when you have a trout in the nest. You won't have the forked tail, and you'll have a lot more of the spotting for the different trout species. Bull trout and brook trout can look fairly similar. I'll show you some differences there. But generally silver overall, and it has the kind of orangish spots. And this one obviously looks a lot different than that photo, so you can kind of see the differences you might see. So this one obviously a lot more kind of golden color, but it has those orange spots, usually with a light halo, and they'll often have the white tipped fins as well. So those are our only two native trout in the system. And that is it for the native fish that Osprey might be bringing in. There's also native fish like sculpins and minnows out there, but it's really unlikely that an Osprey would be bringing one of those back because they're all really small. We'll move on to the non-native fish in the lower Bitterroot. And one I think that you mentioned you're seeing a lot of is the northern pike. Is that right?
Yes, we have, particularly this year, Tori. I haven't noticed them as prevalent in previous years, and maybe it's the fishing preference of the particular male osprey. But we've seen a number of them come in. They can get pretty large.
Yes, they can. I'll show you a picture of one from the lower Bitterroot after this that was quite big. So this one, really easy to tell, that long pointed snout with a big mouth. No other fish in the Bitterroot has that. And also you'll see these big fins at the back that are kind of almost equal in size and on top and bottom. That's also really distinctive of pike. Pike should be pretty easy to identify from all of the other fishes because of those weird fins and that weird head. So that should be pretty easy to do. So this is a non-native fish. It's considered invasive in a lot of areas because they're really aggressive predators, and they'll eat almost anything. They'll eat small ducks, snakes, frogs, lizards. They'll eat pretty big fish. There's a lot of videos out there of pike that have actually choked to death trying to eat fish that were too big for their mouths. So they're really aggressive. They can reproduce really quickly, and have a lot of them. So in systems where northern pike have taken over, you often get to the point where you just have a bunch of northern pike that are all the same length. They're like 20 to 15 to 25 inches, and they're all the same size, and there's just tons of them, and they're everywhere, and there's almost no other fish around. And that's what can sometimes happen with northern pike because they're so aggressive. They're an ambush predator, so they're almost always in really slow or mostly still water, sitting down in the vegetation or under a log or under overhanging tree and just waiting for something to come by, and then they rush out and grab it. So people that fish really like them because they're aggressive and they chase streamers, and I've heard they're actually pretty good to eat. But ecologically, they can be a bad situation because they're feeding on so many different species, including others that we're concerned about, like ducks and frogs and those sorts of things. But they are really vulnerable to osprey because they like to hang out in shallow water, warm, shallow water, and they stay still, and they're big and easy to see. So that's probably why you're seeing a lot of them showing up, because all those sloughs and ponds around there are just filled with young pike, and they're just out in the open all the time because they're really not used to things eating them. So it's a good target for an osprey. So this was a northern pike that I caught on the Bitterroot, probably 3 or 4 miles above Dunrovin Ranch. So you can imagine something that big, a duckling or a snake or something like that, is really nothing to that. That thing is just going to gobble it right up. So when you get a bunch of those in the system, they are the top predator underwater, and they are an apex predator. There's nearly nothing that eats them once they get that big. And that's these size fish are the real danger, because they will just swim around eating up trout and pikeminnow and all the native fish, or all the game fish that people really want. So another one that I just remembered before this presentation started, there are largemouth bass in the lower Bitterroot. They're pretty rare. And I think I saw one of these in the photos that you showed me. But these ones have this really unique dorsal fin. It's very spiky. So a lot of times you'll see people that fish grabbing the whole bass by their lip. And that's because if you try to grab them by the body, the spines on the fins are really spiky and hurt a lot. So this one, again, no fork in the tail, almost always a green color on the body with this dark stripe down the side. And you'll see that this is called the lateral line. This is actually a sensory organ on fish, has that curve to it. I think that's pretty distinctive for trout, or for bass. Big mouth, but those fins are really distinctive. Again, they're kind of like the fins of the pike in the back, but it also has this front fin here, which is distinctive. And compared to a pike, it also doesn't have as forked of a tail in the back. This one is almost always in still water. I've never seen one in the moving water. I've only caught maybe 3 in 20 years of fishing the Bitterroot. So they're pretty rare, but they are really vulnerable to osprey, again, because they're just sitting there in the water column, just like pike, and they're dark color on the back, so they're pretty easy to see from above.
So, Tori, when you're
Mhm.
talking about these fish, can you give us an indication of how they got here? For example, the pike and the bass, were those what you call, midnight bucket fish? Fishermen dump them in the stream so that they could have them to fish. Is that basically how they got here?
Yep, that's exactly right. So, like rainbow trout and brown trout were stocked by state game agencies. They still are in some areas. So those all come from stocked populations a long time ago. They're very wild now. They've reproduced in the river for many generations, but they were introduced on purpose. In this area, largemouth bass and northern pike were likely introduced by people that wanted to have them. Yeah, bucket biology, exactly what you were saying. People that wanted to fish for them but didn't realize the potential ecological harm they could be causing by doing that. Bass are another common predator of baby turtles and frogs and ducklings and things like that. They don't get nearly as big as pike, but they do eat a lot of those things. So there wasn't really a species that was filling that niche here before the pike and bass showed up. That niche being in the backwaters and the ponds and being ambush predators. We didn't have many fish like that except maybe the pikeminnow. So that's a new predator, a new type of predator here for those native wildlife that they haven't evolved with and that they're not used to. So these fish can be pretty harmful. And I didn't even have a picture of anybody with a northern bass they caught, so there's just a photo of what they look like underwater. Again, dark line down the side and that sort of double fin on top is really distinctive. So the last three fish we'll talk about are the non-native trout. So these are the game fish species, the one that you see all those people fishing on the river and floating by all the time. These are the ones they're really going after the most. These and the Westslope cutthroat. So rainbow trout is the most widespread trout in the world. If it wasn't such an important game fish, it would be considered one of the most invasive species on the entire planet. They can survive a huge range of conditions. There's all sorts of subspecies out there. They've been introduced to water bodies throughout the entire world, and they're very, very prolific. They survive really well despite any sort of conditions or any sort of adverse conditions. So they're just everywhere. But they're really beautiful. They're really fun to catch on a fly rod. They still do provide, food for ospreys and food for other fish. So they're not like bass and pike where they can kind of take over the system and cause this really big ecological disruption. But they do, like I said, hybridize with Westslope cutthroats and compete for food with those native fish. So you'd probably be pretty likely to see these coming into the osprey nest. Is that true? You've seen them? Yeah.
And they're pretty easy to identify. By color, and then they have that little fin before the tail on the top. What do you call that fin?
That is the adipose fin.
Adipose fin.
Yep, and all trout have those. I don't remember if the Westslope does. Yeah, all trout have that adipose fin. But on rainbows, you will see the white tips on the bottoms of the lower fins. And again, you may have that range of fish between Westslope cutthroats and hybrids and pure rainbows. But mostly rainbows have the dark olive back and a big pink or red stripe down the middle. And then compared to the cutthroat, you'll notice that spotting is really even across the whole body. Whereas with the cutthroat, it was really concentrated towards the back. So that's distinctive for the rainbow trout as well.
So, Tori, where were rainbow trout native? Where do they originate from?
So rainbow trout are native in like Alaska and along the Pacific British coast. I don't think they were native anywhere on the East Coast. They're native in Russia, I believe. I'm going to get this wrong. I don't know where exactly they're native, but we do have native populations in northwest Montana, really, really isolated small populations called red band rainbow trout. And then there's also species that migrate between salt and fresh water, which are called steelhead, which is a rainbow trout species that's, I think the term is Andromedas.
Anonymous. Yeah, I used to study salmon in Alaska. And in fact, I do believe that what they call the Atlantic salmon are actually steelhead. Salmonoids that are from the Pacific, I believe.
Okay.
I have to look that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I've
I
caught
think
lots of
that-
these rainbow trout down there. They're all over in that lower river.
Yeah, well, and salmon have been introduced into the southern hemisphere in Chile and New Zealand.
Oh yeah, that's true. I remember there's like some big movement to protect a watershed in there, even though it's all non-native fish or protected fish. Yeah. So just to show you, kind of rainbow trout can obviously look very different. Here's one that's covered in tons and tons of spots, but you still see that white tip, the white tip fins. That's not always going to be there. So if you don't see that, it doesn't mean it's not a rainbow. But if it is there, it's almost always a rainbow. And so these are pretty vulnerable to osprey because they're everywhere in the river and they're bold and they hang out in shallow water and they're feeding near the surface a lot, which makes them vulnerable. So they're a lot more vulnerable than our next species, which is the brown trout. Brown trout are much more predatory. They like deeper waters. They like to be under cover a lot more often. They almost never come into shallow water unless it's to feed, and that's almost always at night when ospreys aren't hunting. So they're much harder to get unless they're pretty small. And then sometimes they act a little bit more like rainbow trout. But for the most part, they hold deeper and are less likely to be out in the open. They have this beautiful golden color, dark brown on the back. They can be anywhere from really, really light brown to really, really dark. And they change, they get really, really bright and golden color in the fall when they're spawning. The red spots along the side with the light halo is very distinctive. Remember, the bull trout had those orange or pink color. Brown trout will have the deep red color. And then the kind of golden color fins. These are pretty distinctive. They're pretty hard to, mess up between a rainbow trout or a cutthroat or any other trout. They're the only fish that's that dark golden brown color. And here's one that doesn't have the red spots on the side, but again, it's so distinctive because of that brown and gold color. And one more fish here, brook trout. This is a really, really beautiful trout. They have this marbling along the top that's distinctive. Some of the bull trout will have this. If there's any fish that might look like a bull trout, it's a brook trout because you'll see very silvery gray versions of brook trout. But the brook trout have that marbling on top, and then they have the pink or red dot with a blue halo around it. So that no other fish will have that. And then they also have the white stripes on the front of the fins. Some bull trout will have something that looks similar to that. But the white and then the black and then that black stripe is actually really distinctive. So the slogan for, when they're trying to protect bull trout in drainage, they put up these signs and the slogan is, if there's no black, put it back, which means it's not a brook trout, it's a bull trout. And that what they're talking about is that black edge on the fins. So look for the marbling, look for the really, really bright kind of crazy colors, the blue halos around the light spots in the middle, and then that black line that's behind the white on the fins. And that's a really, really small one. Generally, they're really small. You might not see many of these coming into the nest because there aren't that many in the lower river. And where they are, or where I've seen them, are mostly associated with like beaver ponds or small tributaries. And they're just such a small fish most of the time that ospreys won't really waste their time with them. So that is all the fish that you might be seeing come into the nest, although I did not cover goldfish because I didn't expect that one.
There's one more that we have, and I'm going to show you.
Oh, and the catfish.
That in fact our members are pointing out here. And let me see if I can bring this up on my screen share.
I guess I'll have to stop here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And let me just, and I've always thought that these fish come from that lake, but again, I'm not sure. And it's these pumpkin sunfish.
Oh yeah. Uh-oh.
Yeah. I mean, we see them come quite frequently.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't think of that one.
Yeah. And I really do think that it is associated with that lake. I'd like to know. So maybe you would ask one of your fisheries people there and get back with me, because it seemed, and this is maybe, you know, casual observation on my part, but it's always been, you know, in the spring, the Bitterroot River can get really turbid during flood conditions. And that's often the times when the male osprey has a hard time bringing in enough fish for the nest. And that's when I tend to see these fish. And and that's why I've been thinking, you know, more stagnant water, more, you know, that lake up there. I'd be interested to know about that.
Yeah, so those, I didn't even think of those, but yeah, I kind of forgot those are in the system now too. So that's another non-native species that they really heavily impact like amphibians because they eat a lot of eggs. They'll just move around in the aquatic vegetation and just pluck off eggs. So impact amphibians a lot, but they are very, very tied to still water systems. You'll almost never find them in moving water. And so that makes a lot of sense. I'm almost guaranteed you're right that they're coming from those ponds. Because I've been into almost all the backwaters on the lower Bitterroot, and I've never seen one in there.
So yeah, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of cool actually that you see that shift when the waters are high.
Yeah, I think it really gives them an alternative source when the Bitterroot's so turbid, you know, and the fishing is difficult. And I've often thought that, you know, we've had less starvation with our osprey chicks here at Dunrovin than the Hellgate nest has experienced. And I've often thought that this little lake nearby has been part of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Makes for a good territory.
It does. I think it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Tori, I'm going to take what you have given us here. Well, we have recorded this, of course. And I think what I'm going to do is draft up a little key, if this, then that.
Okay.
And I'll send it to you so you can either you can chime in and review what I've done, because it might be kind of fun for us to have, and I'll maybe steal some of your photos and point out the things that we might want to be looking for as we identify these fish that come. And I'm going to go back to, I'll screen share again, go back to those fish that I showed you at the
that'd be great.
At the very beginning, just because, hang on here, I got to get it back. I mean, there's only certain parts of the fish that we can see. Like here, you get a really good view of the fin, the tail fin. And so what I might try to do is kind of focus on the very distinctive parts. So looking at this, what would you call this fish, Tori?
So I think that is a northern pikeminnow. And you pointed out the thing that I was focusing on was the forked tail. And that what I was tossing between was a northern pikeminnow or a whitefish. Both have a pretty forked tail, but what I was seeing here is a rib that I think it's called the caudal fin, the one on the bottom of the fish right in front of the tail. That's really, really big, and it looks kind of thick and loby. It's not like clear and thin like on a whitefish.
Right.
Also, the stripe down the middle. Remember, I talked about the pike minnows have that stripe down the middle that's usually visible. And then overall size, that would be a really big whitefish. Just don't see those very often. So those are kind of the clues I was using to arrive at that. I wouldn't say I'm 100% sure, but I'm pretty darn confident that that's a pikeminnow.
Pikeminnow. That's great. And so you were surprised to see this catfish.
Really? Yeah.
And that's a pretty big catfish.
Yeah, hopefully that's coming from those ponds too. I'm hoping those aren't getting established in the Bitterroot River. Yeah. That's another non-native that can be pretty harmful.
So here we go. So this is, give us your clues here. We don't have a head.
Yeah. So I think that one must be a largemouth bass. So what I'm looking at there is it's got a very tall, thick body, and I can kind of see that dark black stripe down the side, dark green elsewhere. The other thing I'm looking at, I don't think, let me just check and make sure I'm right here. So you'll see it has this fin here, the pectoral fin.
Yes.
And it also has these fins here. A whitefish, which is the other thing I was thinking it could be, will not have those fins right there. I can't remember what those fins are called, but that's something that I'm pretty sure that fin is unique to the bass species. Don't think you'll see that on other fish where they have the pectoral fin and those fins right below it. You'll see that on the pumpkin seed too. But just those types of fish, the bass and pumpkin seed are kind of closely related. So that's what I'm going with there. I'm pretty confident on that one as well.
Very good. This is really fun. I'm going to stop sharing here. And I want to go and check to see if we don't have any more questions on our chat. Okay. People have really enjoyed this, Tori. It's very, very helpful. So I am going to take your presentation and kind of work it over and put it into something that people can use throughout the season to help us identify what's coming to the nest. It's been a lot of fun for us to watch this and to, kind of get an idea of different species. And this is really the first year that I have been, really noticing a lot of pike. And
Do you know like what the most common fish is, or do you have any of those kind of stats compiled yet?
Well, this year we had Michael Academia working with us, and he has gone through and looked at all of the photos. So at the end of the season, he will give us a breakdown of the fish that he has identified. And I'll certainly share that with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, because I think that will be of great interest. We looked at 12 different nests this year, including 3 from Europe and 1 from Canada, and the rest were all from the United States. And we were, the primary focus was on the number of fish that were being brought to the nests. And we had a mixture of seawater, coastal nests and freshwater inland nests, and some were on lakes and others were on rivers like Dunrovin. And so it's been really interesting to see the variation in the kinds of fish that are being brought and in the numbers of fish.
Yeah, that's cool. There wasn't many reports of, I was trying to find kind of proportions and numbers of fish in this type of system. I really didn't find much. So I think that's some pretty new information, new science you guys are doing. That's really cool.
Yeah, he's going to be publishing this. So, and all of our members helped in that project by taking screen captures and notifying him when the fish came so that he could go right to it in the recordings.
Cool. Well, thank you all for doing that. That helps us with management too. So that's great.
Yeah, citizen science. It's been really
absolutely
fun. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, Tori, you're just so good at this. I'm going to come back knocking at your door.
Okay. We have to do beavers sometime.
Oh, and muskrats.
Oh.
We found a family of muskrats on the river Cameron just the other night.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Very cool.
And they had we saw them with 4 little ones, and they were still pretty little. I thought they would be a little bit larger by this time of the year, but they weren't. Yes, we would love to do beaver, and south of us on the state land, I'd love to talk with the DNRC and to see if we couldn't get a web camera on that piece of property down there, because number one, there's that marsh where the sandhill cranes nest, and and we saw some colts this year at our bird feeder. And then there has been an active beaver down there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so very cool.
Great. Yeah.
Good. Well, you're terrific. You're a lot of fun to work with, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Really appreciate it. And I want to say goodbye to everybody. I know this has been a lot of fun for everybody. Thanks again. Sorry.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.